I can't do this. Not again. Maggie Caldwell's hands trembled as she fastened the leash onto the worn collar of the old golden retriever sitting at her feet. His milky eyes blinked in her direction, sensing her presence but seeing nothing. The crisp autumn air in the small town of Cedar Grove nipped at her face, making it harder to breathe as she prepared for what she had to do. It wasn't the cold, though. It was the guilt. She had tried. For weeks, she had posted on every online forum, knocked on doors, made flyers, but no one had claimed the dog. No one had even recognized him. It was as if he had simply appeared out of nowhere. And now Maggie had no choice but to bring him to the shelter, the kind that didn't promise a happy ending. She had named him Gus. The name just fit. It felt old and warm, like the worn-out flannel her father used to wear. Gus had followed her home one evening, his steps cautious yet trusting. She had given him food, water, and a soft bed, hoping someone would come looking for him. But days turned into weeks, and with each passing day, she knew the chances of him finding a home were slipping away. Her little rental house already had 2 rescue dogs, both younger and full of energy, barely fitting within her modest means. And Gus, well, he was blind, slow-moving, and needed more care than she could provide. The shelter was full, she knew that, but there weren't many options left. She bent down, rubbing her hands over his soft golden fur. "I'm sorry, buddy," she whispered, feeling her throat tighten. Gus simply nuzzled into her palm, as if telling her it was okay. Maggie forced herself to stand. She took a deep breath, gripped the leash tightly, and led Gus toward her old pickup truck. He trusted her. That's what made this so hard. His tail wagged gently as she helped him onto the seat, his body sinking into the worn fabric like he belonged there. The drive to the shelter was quiet except for the occasional sigh from Gus. Maggie kept her eyes on the road, refusing to let the tears spill over. She had done the right thing. She had tried. The shelter was on the outskirts of town, a modest building with chain-link fences surrounding the outdoor runs. Maggie had volunteered there once, years ago, back when she believed every dog had a chance. She parked the truck and sat still for a moment, gripping the wheel like it was the only thing keeping her together. Then she turned to Gus. "Come on, boy." She clipped the leash to his collar and helped him down. He stumbled slightly but caught himself, then turned toward her, his tail wagging again. The moment they stepped inside, the smell of disinfectant and damp fur hit her. The shelter's front desk was staffed by an older woman with silver hair pulled into a ponytail. She recognized Maggie immediately. "Maggie, what brings you here?" Maggie swallowed hard. "I found this guy a few weeks ago. Did everything I could to find his owner. No luck." She hesitated before adding, "I can't keep him." The woman's eyes softened as she looked at Gus. "He's a sweet old boy, but you know the situation here. We're overcrowded." Maggie nodded, forcing herself to remain steady. She knew the shelter's reality. Older dogs, especially ones with disabilities, didn't get adopted easily. And the unspoken truth was clear. If no one adopted him soon, Gus wouldn't have long. She bent down and unfastened his collar, brushing her fingers over the worn leather as she handed it to the woman. It was only then that she noticed something she hadn't seen before. A tiny metal plate was sewn into the inside of the collar, its surface scratched but still legible. Her brow furrowed as she held it closer to the light. The words were faint but clear. "If found, return to Thomas Reed." Maggie's heart pounded. Thomas Reed. She didn't recognize the name, but this was something, a lead. She turned back to the woman at the desk. "Do you have a phone book? Maybe I can find him." The woman nodded, disappearing into a back office before returning with a thick, outdated directory. Maggie flipped through the pages, scanning for the name, her fingers trembling slightly. There, Thomas Reed, listed with an address just outside town. She looked down at Gus, who was sitting patiently by her side, unaware of how close he had come to losing everything. Maggie felt something shift inside her. She couldn't leave him here. Not now. Not with this chance. She met the woman's eyes. I think I need to make a stop before I leave. With renewed energy, she fastened the collar back onto Gus and led him toward the truck. The drive to the address was short, only 15 minutes outside Cedar Grove, down a winding road lined with old oak trees. The house that came into view was a modest farmhouse, its white paint peeling slightly from the years. Maggie pulled into the driveway and stepped out, her heart pounding. She knocked firmly, stepping back as she waited. Footsteps approached, slow and steady. When the door opened, an older man stood there, his weathered face lined with deep creases. His eyes widened when he saw Gus. Gus? The name escaped his lips like a whisper, full of disbelief. The dog perked up at the sound of the voice. His ears twitched, and suddenly, as if recognizing the scent, he lunged forward, his tail wagging furiously. The man fell to his knees as Gus buried his face into his hands, licking his fingers as if trying to memorize them all over again. Maggie stood frozen, watching the scene unfold. The man looked up at her, his eyes glistening. Where did you find him?" She swallowed the lump in her throat. "He found me, actually." The man shook his head in amazement, stroking the old dog's fur. "I thought I'd lost him forever." His voice broke slightly before he steadied himself. "Come in, I need to tell you the story." Maggie hesitated before stepping inside, glancing at Gus, who was still pressed against the man, his tail wagging like he was home again. She had been prepared for an ending, but maybe, just maybe, this was a new beginning. Maggie stepped into the house, the wooden floor creaking slightly under her feet. It smelled of old books, pine, and a faint hint of coffee. The walls were lined with framed photos, some too far for her to make out, but many had dogs in them. Thomas Reed moved slowly, his hand never leaving Gus's back as he led them toward the living room. The dog pressed close to his leg, as if afraid to lose him again. Maggie took a seat on the worn leather couch as Thomas settled into a recliner. He sighed, looking down at Gus, who had curled up at his feet like he had done it 1,000 times before. His fingers brushed the old dog's fur, his expression unreadable. "I thought he was gone," he said after a long pause. His voice was thick with emotion, though he kept it steady. 2 years! That's how long it's been. Maggie's heart clenched. 2 years! Gus had been missing for that long? She leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees. What happened? Thomas rubbed a hand over his face before looking up at her. My wife passed away a little over 2 years ago. Cancer. It took everything out of her, and by the end it took everything out of me too. Gus, he was hers as much as he was mine. He never left her side, not even when she could barely move. He stayed with her until the very last moment. Maggie stayed silent, letting him speak. She knew what loss felt like. Maybe not in the same way, but she recognized that weight in his voice. After she was gone, I wasn't much good to anyone, he continued. I spent my days sitting right here, staring at nothing. Gus tried, he really did. But I wasn't myself, and I think he knew it. One day a storm rolled in. Bad one. The wind knocked down one of the gates out back. I didn't notice until it was too late. Gus was gone. Maggie swallowed. You looked for him. Thomas nodded. For weeks, months, I put up flyers, called every shelter in the county, drove up and down every road hoping I'd see him. Nothing. It was like he disappeared, and after a while I started to think maybe it was my fault. He let out a shaky breath. Maybe he knew I wasn't me anymore. Maybe he needed something I couldn't give him. Maggie's throat tightened. I don't think that's true. Thomas gave a sad smile. Maybe not. Maybe it doesn't matter now. What matters is that he's here. Gus let out a soft sigh, his tail thumping lightly against the floor. Maggie watched as the old man ran his hand along the dog's back, a look of quiet gratitude settling in his eyes. How did you find him? Thomas asked after a moment. Maggie leaned back against the couch. He found me, actually. Showed up one night while I was walking home. He was thin, tired, but still had fight in him. I took him in, tried to find his owner. I thought maybe he'd been abandoned or lost recently, but no one recognized him. I was about to take him to the shelter when I saw the message on his collar. Thomas's fingers brushed the worn leather. I put that there when he was a pup. Always told my wife that if anything ever happened, someone would bring him back to us. Maggie felt a lump in her throat. If she had taken Gus to the shelter, if she hadn't checked the collar, he would have been another old dog left waiting for a miracle that never came. Do you know where he might have been all this time? She asked. Thomas exhaled slowly. Hard to say. If he survived on his own, he must have found food somewhere. Maybe someone took him in for a while but couldn't keep him. Maybe he wandered from town to town, looking for something familiar. The fact that he found his way back, though. He shook his head. That means something. Maggie nodded, knowing exactly what he meant. Some things were more than coincidence. The room fell into a comfortable silence, the kind that didn't need to be filled with words. Gus had relaxed completely, his chest rising and falling in slow, even breaths. Thomas cleared his throat. I can't thank you enough for bringing him back. Maggie smiled, though there was a bittersweet note to it. I think he would have found his way to you no matter what. Thomas chuckled, the sound rusty from disuse. Maybe so, but I'm glad you were part of the journey. Maggie sat with that for a moment before glancing at the clock. It was getting late. She hadn't meant to stay so long, but she wasn't sorry she had. She stood, stretching slightly. I should probably get going. Thomas looked up, something flickering across his expression. Would you stay for dinner? She hesitated. Oh, I don't want to impose. You wouldn't be, he interrupted gently. It's been a long time since I had company, and I'd like to hear more about Gus, if you don't mind. Maggie glanced at Gus, who was still curled at Thomas's feet, perfectly at home. She thought of her own quiet house, the meal she would throw together quickly before settling in for another night alone. Then she looked back at Thomas, at the way he sat a little taller now, a little lighter. She nodded. Okay, dinner sounds nice. Thomas smiled, and for the first time since she had met him, it looked like something in him had shifted. Like maybe, just maybe, this was the start of something new. Maggie followed him into the kitchen, where the warmth of the old house wrapped around her, and the quiet sound of Gus's paws against the floor followed behind. The kitchen smelled of something rich and familiar, the kind of scent that wrapped itself around memories of home. Maggie watched as Thomas moved about, opening cabinets and pulling ingredients together with the ease of someone who had done it for years. Gus sat nearby, his ears perked as he followed the sounds of his owner's every movement. Maggie felt a strange warmth settle in her chest. She had expected this visit to be short, a quick drop-off, a polite conversation, and then back to her life. But here she was, sitting at a small wooden table, listening to the quiet clatter of dishes, while a dog who had nearly been lost forever lay at their feet like he had never left. You like stew? Thomas asked, glancing over his shoulder. Maggie nodded. Yeah, haven't had homemade in a while. Thomas chuckled as he stirred the pot on the stove. Well, this one's nothing fancy. Just the way my wife used to make it. Kept me going all these years. Maggie watched him for a moment, noting the way his hands moved with certainty. There was something comforting about the way he worked, like every step was muscle memory. He had lost a lot, that much was clear, but there was still something steady in the way he carried himself. She glanced down at Gus, who had rested his head on his paws, his tail twitching slightly in contentment. "I think he's happy to be home." Thomas nodded, not looking up from the stove. "I was afraid he wouldn't remember, that maybe too much time had passed." "He knew," Maggie said softly, "the second you said his name." Thomas was quiet for a long moment before he sighed. Dogs never forget the people they love. A lump formed in Maggie's throat at that. She thought of her own 2 dogs back home, waiting for her. They had been with her through her hardest times, never once wavering in their loyalty. The way Gus had reacted to Thomas was proof that love didn't fade with time, at least not for a dog. She glanced at the clock. It was later than she had expected, but she didn't feel the usual rush to leave. Thomas set 2 bowls on the table before taking a seat across from her. Gus, ever patient, sniffed the air but didn't make a move to beg. Maggie took a bite of the stew, letting the warmth of it settle deep in her stomach. It was simple but good, the kind of meal that spoke of years of tradition. For a while they ate in comfortable silence. Then Thomas set his spoon down, his expression turning thoughtful. "You know, I never really thought about what would happen if I found him again." Maggie tilted her head. "What do you mean?" "I spent so long thinking he was gone that I never considered what I'd do if he came back." He looked down at Gus, his fingers tapping absently against the table. "He's older now, slower, not the same dog that ran through these fields like he owned them." Maggie studied him carefully. "He still seems happy." Thomas nodded. "I hope so." He let out a slow breath. "I just don't know if I can take care of him the way he needs. I'm not as young as I used to be." Maggie's stomach tightened. She hadn't considered that possibility. She had assumed that finding Gus's owner would mean he was finally where he belonged. But now she saw the uncertainty in Thomas's eyes, the way his hands rested too still on the table. "Are you saying you're not keeping him?" she asked carefully. Thomas looked pained as he reached down, running his fingers through Gus's fur. "I don't know." Maggie's heart ached for him, for Gus, for the way life had a habit of pulling people apart and bringing them back together only to present new obstacles. "I can help," she found herself saying, "if you need anything for him, food, vet visits, anything like that." Thomas shook his head. "I appreciate that, but it's not just about the cost. It's making sure he has someone who can give him what he needs. He's been through a lot." Maggie swallowed. She had just gotten him home. The idea of Gus having to go through another transition, another shift in what was supposed to be permanent, made her stomach twist. "Maybe we take it one day at a time," she suggested. "See how things go before you decide anything." Thomas considered her words, his fingers still moving gently along Gus's back. Then he nodded. "One day at a time." A silent understanding passed between them. The night stretched on, filled with quiet conversation and the occasional sound of Gus's contented sighs. By the time Maggie finally stood to leave, she felt something different settle inside her. This hadn't been just a stop along the way. It was something more. Thomas walked her to the door, Gus trailing behind. "Thank you," he said, "for everything." Maggie smiled. "I think Gus did most of the work." Thomas chuckled. "Maybe so." She gave Gus one last scratch behind the ears before stepping outside. The night air was cool, crisp with the promise of the changing season. As she got into her truck, she glanced in the rearview mirror and saw Thomas standing there, Gus sitting beside him, both watching as she pulled away. As she drove back toward town, Maggie couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end of something. If anything, it was just the beginning. Maggie woke the next morning with Gus still on her mind. The drive home the night before had felt longer than usual, the road stretching ahead of her in a way that made her feel restless. Sleep hadn't come easily. She had tossed and turned, thinking about the uncertainty in Thomas's voice, the hesitation in his hands as he stroked Gus's fur. The dog had finally made it home, but now home wasn't so certain. She made coffee and stared out the window of her small kitchen, her own 2 dogs curled up on the couch. They had greeted her the night before with their usual excitement, tails wagging, noses pressing against her hands as if checking to make sure she hadn't brought another stray into their world permanently. They were good dogs. They had been with her long enough to know that sometimes she did bring home lost souls, even if only for a little while. She exhaled and grabbed her keys. She hadn't planned on heading back to Thomas's so soon, but the feeling in her chest told her she needed to. She wasn't sure if it was concern, curiosity, or something else, but she wasn't ready to walk away from this story yet. The drive was quiet. The early morning light stretched over the fields, turning the sky soft and golden. When she pulled into Thomas's driveway, she saw him sitting on the porch, a steaming mug in his hands. Gus was stretched out beside him, his head resting on his paws, ears twitching at the sound of her truck. Thomas looked up as she stepped out. "Morning." "Morning," Maggie replied, shoving her hands into her jacket pockets. "Hope I'm not dropping in too early." "Not at all," he said, gesturing to the empty chair beside him. "Coffee?" She nodded and sat as he disappeared into the house for a moment, returning with a second mug. The warmth of it settled into her hands, grounding her. Gus lifted his head slightly, his tail brushing against the porch floor in a lazy wag. "How's he doing?" she asked, nodding toward the dog. Thomas took a slow sip before answering. "Good. Better than I expected, honestly. It's like he never left. He found his old spot by the fireplace last night, curled up there just like he used to. Didn't even hesitate." Maggie smiled. "That's a good sign." Thomas nodded, though his expression was unreadable. "I just keep thinking about all the time we lost. 2 years is a long time." "It is. She agreed, watching as Gus stretched before settling back down with a deep sigh. But dogs don't hold grudges. To him, it probably feels like he just took a long detour. He's here now. That's what matters. Thomas looked at her then, something thoughtful in his eyes. "You have a way of looking at things, don't you?" She shrugged. "Just spent a lot of time around dogs. They teach you things." He chuckled, shaking his head. "That they do." The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind that felt natural, like they had known each other longer than just a day. Maggie wasn't sure what to do with that feeling. "I was thinking," Thomas said after a while, "about what you said last night, taking it one day at a time." She turned to him, waiting. "I want to do right by him," he continued. "But I'm not as strong as I used to be, and I don't know what's ahead for me. I can't let him go through losing another home if I can't keep up." Maggie nodded slowly, understanding more than she wished she did. "I get that. I don't want to make a decision too fast," he added. "So I was wondering if you'd help me figure it out. Maybe come by every now and then. Make sure I'm keeping up with what he needs." Maggie felt something settle inside her, like a puzzle piece clicking into place. "Of course. Whatever you need." Thomas exhaled, and for the first time since she'd met him, she saw something that looked like relief in his features. "Good, that's good." Gus thumped his tail against the floor, as if approving of the arrangement. Maggie took another sip of coffee and glanced at Thomas. "I have to ask, Do you think he remembers the way home? Thomas frowned slightly. What do you mean? He found me, she said, thinking out loud now. He wandered who knows how far, and yet somehow he ended up close enough that I could bring him back. Do you think he was trying to get here the whole time? Thomas looked down at Gus, running a hand over his head. If he was, he's smarter than I gave him credit for. Maggie smiled. Dogs don't forget where they belong, even if it takes them a while to get back. Thomas hummed in agreement, his gaze distant. Maybe there's something to that. They sat in silence again, drinking coffee as the morning settled around them. The leaves rustled in the breeze, the world waking up in slow, quiet movements. Gus let out another deep sigh, the kind that spoke of peace, of finding something he had been looking for. Maggie didn't know what would happen next. She wasn't sure if Thomas would ultimately decide he could keep Gus or if some other decision was waiting down the road. But for now, one day at a time seemed like enough. Maggie didn't intend to make visiting Thomas and Gus a habit, but something about the old dog and his owner kept pulling her back. A few days after their last conversation, she found herself driving down the familiar country road again, a bag of dog treats sitting on the passenger seat beside her. She had no real reason for coming, other than a feeling that Thomas might need the company. Or maybe she just wasn't ready to walk away from their story yet. When she pulled into the driveway, she saw Thomas outside near the barn, stacking firewood into neat piles. Gus was sprawled out in the sun, his golden fur catching the light, his tail wagging lazily at the sound of her truck. Maggie smiled and climbed out, stretching her legs as she approached. "You sure you should be doing that alone?" she called out, nodding toward the stack of firewood. Thomas grunted, wiping his forehead with the back of his sleeve. "I may be old, but I'm not useless." Maggie smirked. "Never said you were." He let out a small chuckle and stepped back, surveying his work. "But I wouldn't say no to an extra set of hands." She set the bag of treats on the porch and rolled up her sleeves. "Then let's get to it." They worked in silence for a while, the rhythm of lifting and stacking filling the space between them. Gus remained close, his ears twitching occasionally at the sounds around him, but mostly he just looked content, like he belonged there. Maggie couldn't help but steal glances at him every so often, amazed by how natural he seemed in this place, as if the past 2 years had never happened. "You ever wonder what he's been through?" she asked after a while. Thomas paused, his hands resting on a log. "All the time?" Maggie wiped her hands on her jeans and looked down at Gus. "I keep thinking about how he found his way to me, how he survived. If someone took care of him for a while, or if he just kept moving, searching for something familiar." Thomas nodded. "I've thought about that too. He doesn't look too worse for wear, all things considered. He lost some weight, sure, but he's not completely broken down." Maggie knelt beside Gus, scratching under his chin. "I wish he could tell us." Thomas exhaled. "Maybe he already has. He made it back, didn't he?" Maggie smiled softly. "Yeah, he did." They finished stacking the last of the wood before heading back toward the house. Thomas poured them both a glass of cold water, while Maggie tossed a treat to Gus, watching as he caught it with surprising precision for a blind dog. "You thinking about keeping him?" she asked after a moment. Thomas didn't answer right away. He took a slow sip of water, his gaze drifting out toward the open fields beyond the barn. "I think he already decided that for me." Maggie grinned. "Smart dog," Thomas chuckled. "Too smart." He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his hands together. "I still worry about the long run, but for now, I'm taking your advice. One day at a time." Maggie nodded, feeling something warm settle in her chest. "That's all you can do." They sat in silence for a while, the afternoon sun stretching long shadows across the porch. Gus let out a contented sigh, curling up beside Thomas's chair, his breathing slow and steady. Maggie knew there were still questions left unanswered, things that neither she nor Thomas could ever truly know about Gus's lost years. But maybe it didn't matter. Maybe what mattered was that he was home, that he had found his way back, and that for now everything felt right. She didn't know what the future held for any of them, but for now that was enough. Maggie didn't expect to return to Thomas's house so soon, but something about that place had a pull on her. It wasn't just Gus, though he was a big part of it. It was the quiet peace of the land, the way Thomas spoke in a way that reminded her of her own grandfather, the way the old farmhouse felt like something solid in a world that never stopped moving. So, when she found herself with a free afternoon, she didn't think twice about making the drive again. She brought along a few supplies, some canned dog food she thought Gus might like, a bag of homemade biscuits she had thrown together that morning, and a few extra blankets she had lying around. Thomas might not need them, but she figured it wouldn't hurt to bring a little comfort. She pulled into the driveway and stepped out, noticing how much more familiar this place felt now. Thomas was on the porch, a book in his hands, though he looked up the moment she arrived. Gus was sprawled out beside him, his ears twitching at the sound of her truck's engine. "Didn't expect to see you today," Thomas said, setting the book aside as Maggie climbed the steps. "Thought I'd drop by," she replied. "Hope I'm not interrupting anything." Thomas shook his head. "Not at all. Gus will be happy to have some extra attention." Maggie grinned and knelt beside the old dog, running her fingers through his thick fur. He sniffed in her direction and let out a happy huff, his tail brushing lazily against the wooden boards of the porch. She pulled one of the biscuits from the bag and held it near his nose. His nose twitched before he gently took it from her hand, chewing with slow contentment. Thomas watched, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You spoil him. He deserves it," Maggie said simply. They sat together on the porch for a while, the kind of silence between them that wasn't awkward, just easy. Maggie sipped from a glass of iced tea Thomas had handed her, while Gus dozed at their feet, his ears flicking every now and then at the distant sounds of the countryside. After a while, Maggie turned to Thomas. "You ever thought about taking him into town, just for a short walk?" Thomas considered that for a moment, his fingers tapping lightly against the arm of his chair. "I don't know. He's slower now. I don't want to push him too much." Maggie nodded. "I get that, but I think he might enjoy it. Just a little stroll, something to remind him of what's out there." Thomas exhaled, rubbing a hand over his chin. "Maybe. Been a long time since I took a dog into town." Maggie smiled. "Well, if you decide to, I'd be happy to go with you. Make it an outing." Thomas chuckled. "You make it sound like a big adventure." "For Gus, it might be," she said, watching as the old dog stretched, his paws pressing against the wooden planks. Thomas seemed to think about that for a moment before nodding. "All right, let's do it." A short while later, they loaded Gus into Maggie's truck. He settled onto the seat between them, his head resting against Thomas's leg, looking as at ease as ever. The drive into town wasn't long, but Maggie could feel the anticipation in the air. It had been years since Gus had been anywhere other than Thomas's land. She hoped this would be a good experience for him. When they arrived, they found a quiet street near the town square and parked. Thomas carefully helped Gus out, the old dog stepping onto the sidewalk with slow, deliberate movements. His ears perked at the new sounds, the distant chatter of people, the hum of passing cars, the rustling of leaves on the trees. Maggie watched as Gus lifted his nose to the air, taking in the scents around him. His tail gave a small wag, and she smiled. "See, he's curious." Thomas nodded, adjusting his grip on the leash. "Let's see where he wants to go." They strolled at a leisurely pace, keeping to the quieter sidewalks. A few people passed by, some giving Gus a curious glance, others smiling warmly. A woman walking her own dog paused, watching as Gus took careful steps forward. He's beautiful, she said. How old? Thomas gave a small smile. Older than he should be for all he's been through. The woman nodded knowingly. Looks like he's in good hands. Thomas glanced at Gus, something soft in his expression. Yeah, I think he is. They continued walking, letting Gus take his time. Maggie noticed the way Thomas watched him, his grip steady but never pulling, letting the dog lead at his own pace. It was a small thing, but it said a lot. After a while, they found a bench near a small park and sat down, letting Gus rest at their feet. Maggie reached down to scratch behind his ears, feeling the warmth of his fur beneath her fingers. You were right, Thomas said after a moment. I think he needed this. Maggie smiled. Sometimes a change of scenery makes all the difference. Thomas exhaled, leaning back slightly. You know, I didn't expect any of this when you showed up with him that night. She tilted her head. Any of what? This, he said simply, gesturing around them. Him being back, you sticking around, the way things have felt different. Maggie looked at him, then down at Gus, who had settled into a peaceful doze. Maybe different is exactly what was supposed to happen. Thomas was quiet for a long moment before nodding. Maybe you're right. The drive back from town was quiet, but it wasn't the kind of silence that felt heavy. It was comfortable, like the kind of stillness that settled after something meaningful. Gus lay stretched out in the back seat, his breathing slow and even, clearly worn out from his adventure. Maggie glanced over at Thomas, who had one hand resting on his knee, the other lightly tapping against the door as he looked out at the passing fields. You're thinking about something, she said after a while. Thomas gave a small chuckle, shaking his head. Guess I am. Maggie waited, giving him space to say whatever was on his mind. He exhaled. It's been a long time since I had a reason to go into town, just for the sake of it. She nodded, keeping her eyes on the road. It's easy to get stuck in routines, harder to step out of them. Thomas let that sit for a moment before nodding. Guess so. Maggie stole a glance at Gus, who was still dozing, his paws twitching slightly. I think Gus enjoyed it. Thomas smiled. Yeah, I think he did. The rest of the ride passed in that same easy quiet, and by the time they pulled into the driveway, the afternoon sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky. Maggie parked and turned off the engine, stretching her arms before stepping out. Thomas opened the back door and gently helped Gus down, the old dog taking a few slow steps before shaking himself out and wagging his tail. Maggie laughed. I think that's his way of saying he approves of the trip. Thomas patted Gus's side. Tough old dog. 2 years out there on his own, and he's still got enough left in him to enjoy a stroll through town. Maggie followed them up the porch steps, watching as Gus found his usual spot near the door and flopped down with a satisfied sigh. She sat on the top step, stretching out her legs in front of her. You ever think about what's next? She asked, looking up at Thomas as he settled into his chair. He raised an eyebrow. Next? For you. For Gus. For all of this. She gestured vaguely towards the house, the land, the life he had built out here. Thomas leaned back, his gaze drifting toward the horizon. I don't know. I spent so much time thinking he was gone that I never really considered what would happen if he came back. Now that he's here, it's like, I don't know, like I'm figuring things out all over again. Maggie nodded. That's not a bad thing. No, Thomas admitted, it's not. They sat there for a long time, the sounds of the countryside filling the space between them. Gus let out another contented sigh, and Thomas reached down, running his fingers through the old dog's fur. You ever think about what's next for you? He asked, glancing over at Maggie. She let out a short laugh. I try not to. Makes things complicated. Thomas smirked. Yeah, it does. Maggie exhaled, watching the way the light changed as the sun dipped lower. I guess I'm figuring things out too. Thomas nodded, and they sat in silence again, both watching as the world moved forward around them, neither of them in any rush to figure out all the answers just yet. A cool breeze swept through the porch, rustling the dry leaves that had gathered along the edges. Maggie pulled her jacket a little tighter around her shoulders and looked over at Thomas, who was still watching the horizon, deep in thought. She wondered what kind of man he had been before Gus had disappeared, before his wife had passed. Had he always been quiet like this? Or had life simply shaped him into someone who preferred silence? You ever think about leaving this place? She asked, her voice softer now, more careful. Thomas didn't answer right away. He reached for the glass of water he had set beside him and took a slow sip before shaking his head. Not really. Thought about selling it once, right after my wife passed. Didn't seem like there was much point in staying back then. Maggie frowned slightly. Why didn't you? Thomas let out a small breath, his fingers absently tapping against the arm of his chair. Because of him, he said, nodding toward Gus. Back then, I told myself if he ever came home, he'd need to find me in the same place. I didn't want to move and have him come back to nothing. Maggie's chest tightened at that. You never gave up on him. Thomas shook his head slowly. Didn't seem right to. She looked down at Gus, who had stretched out on his side, his breathing deep and steady. I think he knew that. Thomas hummed, neither confirming nor denying it, but Maggie could tell the thought meant something to him. The sun had dipped lower now, painting the sky in shades of gold and soft orange. It was the kind of evening that felt endless, like time had slowed just enough to let them sit there a little longer without the world rushing them forward. Maggie ran a hand through her hair and let out a soft chuckle. I didn't expect to be here this long. Thomas smirked. Guess you're getting stuck in a routine too. She raised an eyebrow at him. Guess I am. Gus let out a small groan and stretched again, one paw pressing against the wooden floorboards. Thomas reached down and gave his head a gentle pat. Not a bad routine to have. Maggie smiled. No, it's not. Maggie didn't plan on going back so soon, but as the days passed, she found herself thinking about Gus and Thomas more than she expected. The quiet rhythm of their world had a way of settling into her thoughts, making her restless in a way she couldn't quite explain. So when the weekend rolled around, she grabbed her keys without hesitation and headed back toward the old farmhouse. The road was familiar now, the turns and landmarks less like a route and more like a path she knew by heart. When she pulled into the driveway, she spotted Thomas sitting on the porch, a cup of coffee in his hands. Gus was stretched out beside him, head resting on his paws, his ears twitching every so often at the sounds of the countryside. Thomas looked up as she stepped out of her truck. Back already? Maggie smirked. Figured I'd check in on my favorite old dog. Thomas chuckled. Well, you made it just in time. I was about to take him for a walk. You feel like joining us? Maggie nodded, and soon they were making their way down the dirt path that stretched behind the house, Gus leading at a slow but steady pace. The land opened up into a wide field, the kind that stretched far enough to make the world feel bigger but not overwhelming. Maggie took in the view, the golden hue of late afternoon light casting long shadows across the grass. He's moving well today, she noted, watching Gus navigate the uneven terrain. Thomas nodded. Better than I expected. Some days are harder for him, but today's a good one. Maggie glanced over at him. How about you? How's your day? Thomas exhaled slowly. Better than most. They walked in comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds coming from the rustling grass and Gus's gentle panting. Every so often the old dog would pause, lift his head as if taking in something unseen, then continue forward with the same quiet determination. "I wonder what he remembers," Maggie mused aloud. "Does he recognize the scents, the feel of the land beneath his paws?" Thomas shrugged. "Maybe. Or maybe he just knows he belongs here." Maggie thought about that as they walked, letting the idea settle. There was something comforting in the thought that home wasn't just a place but a feeling, something that lingered even after time and distance tried to erase it. By the time they circled back toward the house, Gus was moving a little slower, but his tail still wagged as he found his spot on the porch again. Maggie leaned against the railing, watching as Thomas lowered himself into his chair with a sigh. "You ever think about what would have happened if he hadn't come back?" she asked. Thomas was quiet for a long moment before shaking his head. "I try not to." Maggie nodded, understanding. Some things were too heavy to dwell on. Some questions were better left unanswered. She stayed a little longer, drinking coffee and talking about nothing in particular. And when she finally got up to leave, she knew she'd be back again soon, drawn once more to the quiet world of an old man, his loyal dog, and the kind of peace that wasn't easy to find anywhere else. The next morning, Maggie found herself thinking about their conversation. It wasn't just the way Thomas had spoken about Gus, but the way he had looked at the land around him, the house, everything that had been a part of his life for so long. He was someone who had built a life around waiting, waiting for Gus to return, waiting for time to pass, waiting for something he wasn't even sure of. She spent the day running errands, but even then she found herself lingering by the pet store, wondering if there was something small she could bring for Gus. In the end, she picked out a soft new bed, something cushioned enough for his aging bones but sturdy enough to last. It wasn't much, but it felt right. When she arrived at Thomas's house again, she found him in the barn, sorting through an old wooden chest. He looked up, surprised but not unwelcoming. "You're starting to show up so often I might start charging rent," he teased. Maggie grinned, holding up the dog bed. "Brought something for Gus." Thomas eyed it before nodding. He'll appreciate that. His old one's gotten pretty worn down." She followed him back to the house, where Gus was curled up in his usual spot. When she set the bed down beside him, he sniffed it curiously before stepping onto it and settling down with a deep sigh. Maggie smiled. "Looks like it's a hit." Thomas watched, his hands resting on the back of a chair. "He deserves comfort, especially now." Maggie hesitated before asking, "You still worried about the long run?" Thomas sighed. "Some days, yeah. I think about what happens if something changes, if I can't take care of him the way I should. But then I see him here, and I know I made the right choice keeping him." Maggie nodded. "You're not in this alone. If you ever need help, you just have to ask." Thomas looked at her then, something unreadable in his expression before he gave a small nod. "I'll remember that." She stayed for dinner that night, the three of them settling into a rhythm that felt more natural than it should. And as she drove home later, she realized that somewhere along the way, Thomas and Gus had become more than just people she had helped. They had become a part of her life in a way she hadn't expected, but didn't mind at all. Maggie wasn't entirely sure why she felt drawn back to Thomas's farm again so soon. She told herself it was because of Gus. That she wanted to make sure he was doing well, that he wasn't showing any signs of struggling after the little trip to town. But deep down, she knew it wasn't just that. There was something about the quiet rhythms of that place, the way it felt timeless and still, that called to her in a way she couldn't quite explain. She set out on a crisp autumn afternoon, the light slanting golden across the fields as she drove. When she pulled into the gravel driveway, she saw Thomas out by the barn again, this time repairing a section of the fence. Gus lay in the grass a few feet away, his head resting on his paws, his tail giving a slow wag as Maggie stepped out of her truck. Didn't know you were coming today, Thomas called out, straightening up and dusting his hands on his jeans. Thought I'd stop by, Maggie replied with a small shrug, smiling at Gus as she approached. The dog lifted his head, his nose twitching as she knelt to scratch behind his ears. How's he doing today? Thomas glanced at Gus, a fond expression crossing his face. Not bad. He's been moving a little slower, but that's just how it goes with an old dog. Maggie nodded. He looks comfortable, at least. He is, Thomas agreed. Got that new bed you brought set up inside. I think he likes it. Maggie smiled at that. Glad to hear it. She stayed out by the barn for a while, chatting with Thomas as he worked on the fence. The conversation flowed easily, touching on small things, how the weather was changing, how the crops in the nearby fields were coming along, how Gus had taken to napping in a sunny patch near the porch most afternoons. It wasn't anything earth-shattering, but it felt meaningful in its own quiet way. Eventually, Thomas dusted off his hands and leaned on the fence post, looking out over the land. You ever spend much time in one place, Maggie? Or are you always moving around? The question caught her off guard. She tilted her head slightly, considering it. I guess I move around more than I stay put. Didn't really think about it until now. Thomas nodded as if her answer made perfect sense. There's something to be said for both. Staying put has its comforts, but you start wondering if maybe you've missed something by not moving. Maggie laughed softly. Grass is always greener, huh? Something like that, Thomas said with a smile. They headed back toward the house together, Gus trailing behind at his own pace. Inside, Maggie set a kettle on the stove while Thomas settled into his chair. The old farmhouse was filled with that warm, lived-in feeling, scuffed wooden floors, a collection of books stacked on a side table, a few framed photos on the mantel that looked like they'd been there for decades. Maggie glanced at the photos, noting a younger Thomas standing beside a woman who had to be his wife. She had a kind face, her smile soft and genuine. Another photo showed Thomas holding a puppy that was unmistakably Gus, his golden fur gleaming even in the faded picture. You look different there, Maggie said, nodding toward the photo. Thomas glanced over and chuckled. That was a long time ago. Gus looks about the same, though, she added with a grin. Doesn't he? Thomas said, his voice tinged with fondness. He's always been a good dog. Even as a pup, he just had this steadiness to him, like he knew what he was here for. Maggie smiled, pouring 2 cups of tea and bringing one over to him. Not every dog has that. Some take years to figure it out. Thomas nodded in agreement. But Gus, he just had it. My wife always said he was an old soul in a young body. Maggie sat down, her cup warming her hands. I can see that. They sipped their tea in a comfortable silence, the kind that didn't need filling. Gus lay down at Thomas's feet, letting out a long sigh as if he had been waiting for this exact moment all day. Maggie watched as Thomas reached down, gently running his fingers through the dog's fur, his expression distant but not sad. It was the kind of look that spoke of years of memories, of something solid and lasting. You know, Thomas said after a while, his voice quiet, I thought about leaving this place after my wife passed. It felt so empty without her, but every time I considered it, I thought about Gus, about how he'd always known this land, these smells, these sounds. I didn't want to take that away from him. Maggie nodded, letting his words sink in. So you stayed. For him. Thomas glanced at her, his expression softening. For him, and maybe for me too, didn't seem right to leave what we built here. This place, it's home, even when it feels lonely. Maggie looked around the room again, taking in the little details, the well-worn furniture, the faded curtains, the way everything seemed to carry a sense of history. It wasn't just a house. It was a life, one that had been lived fully and honestly. She could understand why Thomas had stayed, why he had held on to this place, even when it must have been difficult. "You ever think about what home means?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper. Thomas tilted his head, considering the question. "Home's not just a place. It's the memories you make there, the people you share it with. It's where you feel like you can just be yourself, without pretending to be something you're not." Maggie smiled. "I like that." They fell into silence again, the sound of the kettle humming softly on the stove, the creak of the old house settling around them. Gus let out a low, contented groan, and Maggie couldn't help but reach down to give him another scratch behind the ears. His tail thumped against the floor, a quiet reminder that even in the simplest moments, there was happiness to be found. As the afternoon slipped into evening, Maggie knew she'd have to head back soon, but she didn't feel rushed. Being here felt right, like she was exactly where she needed to be, and she had a feeling she'd be back again before long. Maggie wasn't sure how many visits it had been by now. The days blurred together, marked by the changing leaves and the subtle shifts in the weather. Autumn was giving way to winter, the crisp air turning colder, the sun setting earlier. Each time she came back, it felt less like an errand and more like a second home. She didn't need an excuse anymore. She simply came when she felt like it. Thomas never seemed surprised to see her. He always greeted her the same way, sometimes with a wry comment about her dropping by unannounced, but always with a smile. Gus would wag his tail and lift his head, his blind eyes searching for her even before she said hello. And the three of them would fall into an easy rhythm, like they had been doing this for years. This time she arrived to find Thomas clearing out the old shed behind the barn. He had told her once that it hadn't been touched in years, not since his wife had started growing herbs and vegetables in a smaller plot closer to the house. The shed had become a kind of time capsule, filled with rusty tools, old gardening equipment, and a few boxes that Thomas claimed he hadn't opened in at least a decade. Maggie wandered over, hands in her pockets, watching as he sorted through the clutter. Gus lay nearby, his nose in the air, sniffing at the crisp breeze. "You finding anything good in there?" she called out, leaning against the barn door. Thomas looked up, wiping his hands on a rag. "Mostly junk, but it's good to get it cleared out. Feels like I'm making space for something." "Something like what?" Maggie asked, genuinely curious. Thomas shrugged, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I don't know yet. Just something." Maggie stepped closer, peering into the shed. There were old clay pots stacked in the corner, a tangled mess of chicken wire, and what looked like an ancient watering can that had seen better days. She picked it up, turning it over in her hands. "You could probably sell some of this stuff. People love vintage things." Thomas chuckled. "If vintage means rusty and broken, sure." She grinned, setting the watering can down. "I'm serious. A coat of paint, some new handles. Someone would buy it." Thomas shook his head, still smiling. "Maybe, but I think I'll just keep it simple. Clean it out, see what's worth keeping, and move on." Maggie nodded, grabbing a pair of gloves and joining him. They worked side by side, sorting through the layers of forgotten objects. Every so often, Thomas would pause to tell her a story about something they found. A set of pruning shears that had belonged to his father, a stack of seed packets that his wife had once ordered in bulk because she thought they'd never run out. Maggie listened, laughing when the stories were funny, and staying quiet when they weren't. It felt like a privilege, being let into this part of his life. By the time the sun began to dip below the horizon, the shed was looking less like a forgotten storage space and more like a place that had potential. Thomas leaned against the doorframe, his arms crossed as he surveyed their progress. Gus had wandered over, his nose brushing against Maggie's leg as she knelt to put a few remaining tools back into a bin. "You've got a knack for this," Thomas said, his voice warm. For cleaning out sheds? Maggie teased, glancing up at him. For making things feel lighter, he replied, his expression softening. Maggie felt her cheeks warm, though she wasn't sure if it was the compliment or the cool evening air. Just glad I could help. Thomas gave her a small nod, and they stood there for a moment, watching as the first stars began to appear in the twilight sky. Gus let out a long, contented sigh, settling down beside them as if to say the day's work was done. When Maggie finally headed home, she realized that what Thomas had said stuck with her, making things feel lighter. Maybe that was why she kept coming back, not just to help them, but because being there helped her too. It was like the weight she carried didn't seem as heavy when she was at that old farm, sharing these small, meaningful moments with Thomas and Gus. And as she drove away, she found herself already looking forward to the next visit. The next time Maggie came by, the air was sharp with the first hints of winter. Frost coated the edges of the fence posts, and the breath of the horses in a nearby field rose like smoke. Maggie parked in the usual spot by the barn, climbing out and tucking her hands into her coat pockets. The chill bit at her cheeks, and she was glad she'd brought the extra scarves she'd found lying around her house. Thomas was already outside, tending to a pile of firewood that needed splitting. His breath came out in puffs as he swung the axe, splitting each log cleanly before tossing it onto the growing stack. Gus was close by, curled up in a patch of sunlight, his tail wagging weakly as Maggie approached. "Morning," she called out. Thomas paused mid-swing, straightening up and resting the axe against the block. "Morning. You sure picked a cold day to come by." Maggie smiled. "Figured you might need some help." She held up the scarves. "And I brought these. Figured you could use an extra layer." Thomas raised an eyebrow, a hint of a smile tugging at his lips. "You trying to tell me I look cold?" "Just trying to keep you from freezing," she replied with a grin. He chuckled and set the axe down. "I appreciate it." Maggie tossed a scarf his way before kneeling down beside Gus. The old dog's nose twitched as she rubbed his ears. "How's he doing today?" Thomas shrugged. "He's got his good days and his slow days. This morning, he was moving pretty well. Got out here on his own." "That's a good sign," Maggie said, giving Gus a treat from her pocket. He took it gently, his tail brushing against the ground in gratitude. She spent the morning helping Thomas with the firewood, the two of them working side by side as the pile steadily grew. They talked about small things, the changing weather, a neighbor's new fence, the stubbornness of the wood they were splitting. The easy rhythm of their conversations felt as natural as the work itself. After a while, Thomas paused, leaning on the axe handle and looking out at the fields beyond the barn. "You ever think about staying in one place for good?" Maggie frowned slightly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Not really. I guess I've always moved around so much that the idea never stuck." Thomas nodded slowly, as if that answer made sense to him. "I've always been the opposite. I've been here so long it's hard to imagine anything else." Maggie looked at Youtham, trying to imagine what it must be like to spend decades in the same place, surrounded by the same fields and fences. "Do you think you'll stay here forever?" Thomas considered that for a moment, his gaze distant. "I used to think so. But lately, I don't know. I've been wondering if maybe there's more out there, something I've been missing." Maggie tilted her head. "What do you mean?" Thomas shrugged, shifting his weight. "Hard to explain. This place has been my whole world for so long, but now that Gus is back, it feels like a door I thought was closed has opened again. Like maybe I'm supposed to do something with that." Maggie nodded slowly, understanding the weight of his words, even if she didn't fully know what he was feeling. Sometimes just having someone Or something, remind you of what's important, can make you see things differently. Thomas glanced at her, his expression unreadable. Yeah, I think that's what it is. They worked in silence for a while after that. The sound of the axe splitting wood, the only noise between them. When the stack was finally finished, Thomas set the axe aside and stretched his back. "You must be freezing," he said, noticing her red cheeks. "I'm fine," Maggie said, though she appreciated the warmth of her scarf. "Come on inside, Thomas said. "I'll make some coffee." They made their way back to the house, Gus trailing behind them at a slower pace. Once inside, Maggie sat at the kitchen table while Thomas busied himself at the stove. The smell of coffee filled the room, blending with the faint scent of wood smoke that lingered from the fireplace in the next room. Thomas set 2 mugs on the table and took a seat across from her. Gus flopped down near the fireplace, letting out a long sigh as he settled into the warmth. Maggie wrapped her hands around the mug, letting the heat seep into her skin. "You know," Thomas said after a few sips, "I never used to talk to people this much." Maggie smiled. "Am I interrupting your peace and quiet?" "No," Thomas said, shaking his head. "It's good. I think I needed it. Gus coming back, and you coming around. It's been a good reminder that I don't have to do everything on my own." Maggie nodded, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the coffee. Sometimes it's nice to have people to lean on. "Yeah," Thomas said softly, "it is." They sat there for a long time, the crackling of the fire and the steady breathing of Gus the only sounds filling the space. Maggie felt at home in a way she hadn't expected, and she could see that Thomas felt the same. It wasn't just about Gus anymore. It was about finding something they both needed, something they hadn't even known they were missing. Maggie woke early the next morning, the weight of the past few months settling in as she made her coffee. The steam rising from the mug curled around her hands, warming her fingers as she stared out the kitchen window. She wasn't sure when she'd started thinking about Thomas and Gus as a fixed part of her life, but somehow they had become just that. She looked at her own 2 dogs, still asleep in their spots, and felt a pang of something she couldn't quite name. Whatever it was, it made her feel restless. By the time she pulled up to Thomas's house, the morning frost had melted into a thin layer of dew. She found him on the porch, reading a newspaper and sipping from a mug that looked just like the one she'd been holding only hours earlier. Gus lay at his feet, his ears twitching occasionally as the wind carried the scent of something familiar. "Morning," she said, stepping out of the truck and grabbing the basket she'd brought with her. She'd packed a few things, some homemade dog treats, a loaf of bread she'd baked the night before, and a book she thought Thomas might like. Thomas looked up, setting the paper down and squinting against the sun. "Morning. You come bearing gifts?" "Something like that," Maggie said with a grin. "Thought you might enjoy a change from your usual breakfast." He chuckled as she handed him the bread. "Can't say no to that." Maggie glanced at Gus, who was sniffing the air, his tail wagging lightly. "How's he doing today?" "Good," Thomas replied, rubbing his fingers along the old dog's back. "I think he likes having you around, perks him up a bit." Maggie smiled. "Well, I like being around him too." They sat on the porch together, eating slices of the bread she'd brought and sipping coffee that Thomas poured for her. The morning unfolded slowly, the kind of quiet that came from being comfortable in someone's presence. They talked about little things, the weather, the latest story in the local paper, the way the frost had come earlier this year. Gus dozed between them, his head resting on Thomas's foot. Maggie watched the way Thomas reached down every so often, his hand moving absently to stroke Gus's fur. It was a simple gesture, one that spoke of years of companionship. She wondered if he even realized he was doing it, or if it had become second nature after all this time. At one point, Thomas leaned back in his chair and let out a long sigh. You know, I've been thinking. Maggie turned to him, waiting. He rubbed his chin, his gaze distant. When Gus first disappeared, I thought I'd never feel settled again. I spent so much time looking for him, hoping he'd come back, that I didn't know what to do with myself when he was gone. And then when he did come back, it was like everything shifted again, like I'd been holding my breath for 2 years and finally let it out. Maggie nodded, staying quiet. She knew he wasn't looking for advice or reassurance. He was just speaking the truth of his experience. Having him back reminded me of a lot of things I'd forgotten, Thomas continued. It reminded me that there's still good in the world, that even when you think you've lost something for good, sometimes it finds its way back to you. Maggie swallowed hard, feeling her own emotions rise. He's a good dog, Thomas. He loves you. Thomas smiled, looking down at Gus. Yeah, and I love him too. They sat there for a long time, the weight of the words settling between them. The sun climbed higher, and Gus eventually stirred, stretching out and letting out a soft groan. Thomas reached down, rubbing his ears. You ready to go for a walk, boy? Gus's tail thumped against the porch, and Maggie laughed. I'll join you. The three of them set off down the familiar path, the one that led through the fields and toward the woods. Gus walked at a slower pace these days, but he still moved with purpose, his nose to the ground, ears perking at every sound. Maggie stayed close, watching the way Thomas kept his hand on the leash, never tugging, just guiding gently. When they reached the edge of the woods, Gus paused, lifting his head as if he could sense something. Thomas stopped too, looking down at him. You remember this place, don't you? Gus wagged his tail, his nose twitching. Maggie watched, her heart aching in a way that felt both sad and joyful. She wondered what memories were coming back to Gus. If he remembered running through these woods as a younger dog, chasing after scents and feeling the wind in his fur. They walked a little farther, eventually stopping at a clearing where the sunlight filtered through the trees in golden beams. Thomas sat down on a fallen log, and Maggie joined him. Gus settled in the grass at their feet, letting out a contented sigh as he rested his head on his paws. This was always one of our favorite spots, Thomas said quietly. My wife and I used to come here with Gus when he was just a pup. We'd sit here for hours, just listening to the woods. Maggie glanced at him, seeing the faint smile on his face. Sounds like a good memory. Thomas nodded. It is. They stayed there for a while, the woods surrounding them in a cocoon of stillness. Gus dozed lightly, his tail occasionally brushing the ground as if he were dreaming of chasing something. Maggie leaned back against the log, closing her eyes for a moment and breathing in the crisp air. It felt like time had paused, like they were the only three beings in the world. When they finally made their way back to the house, the sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the fields. Maggie knew it was time for her to head home, but she felt reluctant to leave. Something about this day felt different, as if it had brought a kind of closure she hadn't realized they needed. Thomas stood on the porch, watching as she climbed into her truck. Gus sat beside him, his tail wagging gently as if to say goodbye. Thanks for coming today, Thomas said, his voice steady. Maggie smiled, resting her hand on the window frame. Thanks for letting me be part of it. Thomas nodded, his hand resting on Gus's head. You'll be back, though, right? Maggie looked at them, the old man and his loyal dog, standing there together on the porch of the home they had built, the life they had reclaimed. Of course, she said, I'll always come back. And as she drove away, the farmhouse growing smaller in her rearview mirror, Maggie felt a quiet certainty settle in her chest. She knew she would return again and again, not out of obligation, but because she couldn't imagine her life without them.